"Your wife isn't standing where you think she is," the black woman said in a calm voice that cut through the elegant ballroom more sharply than the crystal glasses clinking beneath the golden chandeliers. For one impossible second, every conversation dissolved into silence. The string quartet kept playing, but no one seemed to hear it anymore. Richard Whitmore, one of the most respected self-made millionaires in New York, stood perfectly still with a polished ebony cane resting against his leg, his unseeing eyes fixed toward the voice that had interrupted the annual charity gala for the Whitmore Vision Foundation. At his side, or at least where he believed she was standing, was his wife, Evelyn Whitmore, the woman who had guided him through 12 years of blindness after a devastating helicopter accident had stolen his sight, but never his ambition. Hundreds of influential guests watched in stunned disbelief as Richard's expression hardened. His hand rose instinctively, brushing against the air before making brief contact with the stranger's shoulder in a firm, impulsive gesture that reflected shock rather than calculation. A gasp rippled across the ballroom. No one moved. No one spoke. Naomi Brooks remained standing exactly where she had been, her posture steady, her breathing controlled despite every pair of eyes now fixed on her. She did not lift her voice. She did not step backward. She simply swallowed once and repeated, "She isn't beside you." Richard's jaw tightened. "Security," he said, his normally measured voice carrying through the marble hall. "Please escort this woman out." Two security officers exchanged uncertain glances before beginning to approach. Naomi never looked at them. Instead, her eyes remained on Richard with a mixture of sadness and quiet conviction. "Sir," she said gently, "I'm not trying to embarrass you." The guests whispered among themselves. Some recognized Naomi from previous charity events. She was a volunteer who helped guide visually impaired guests through the museum during fundraising evenings. Others assumed she must be seeking attention from one of America's wealthiest philanthropists. Neither assumption came close to the truth. Richard slowly turned his head toward the place where he believed Evelyn was standing. A faint smile crossed his face, the kind born from complete trust. "My wife has been beside me all evening," he answered with absolute certainty. Naomi closed her eyes for a heartbeat before opening them again. "No, sir," she replied softly. "She hasn't." Somewhere behind Richard, a champagne flute was carefully placed on a silver tray. The sound was delicate, almost invisible beneath the orchestra, yet Naomi noticed it immediately. So did something deep inside her memory. Years of caring for her blind father had taught her that sight was only one way to understand a room. Distance had a sound. Footsteps had weight. Perfume drifted differently, depending on where someone stood. Silence itself could reveal more than words. Richard's fingers tightened around the handle of his cane. "Enough," he said quietly. "I've spent 12 years trusting the woman I married. You don't get to question that." Naomi nodded with genuine respect. "I know how much you trust her," she answered. "That's exactly why I had to speak." The security officers were only a few feet away now. Around them, cameras from local media crews slowly turned toward the unfolding scene, capturing every expression, every whisper, every uncertain glance. Evelyn still hadn't spoken. That, more than anything else, made Naomi's heartbeat quicken. She had been listening carefully since Richard entered the ballroom nearly 20 minutes earlier, and something had felt wrong from the very first greeting. A detail so small that almost no one else would ever notice it. A detail that would soon change everything Richard Whitmore believed about the people closest to him. The two security officers slowed as they reached Naomi, not because they questioned Richard's authority, but because something about her composure unsettled them. She was not arguing. She was not pleading. She simply folded her hands in front of her and waited, her attention still resting on the man who believed he had heard everything except the one thing that mattered. The ballroom shimmered beneath warm golden lights reflected across polished marble floors, while conversations returned in cautious whispers, each guest trying to decide whether they had just witnessed an act of courage or an unforgivable insult. Naomi Brooks had spent most of her life being underestimated. Growing up in a modest neighborhood outside Baltimore, she learned before she turned 12 that caring for someone who could not see required more than patience. Her father, Daniel Brooks, had lost his eyesight after a construction accident when she was only 8 years old. Overnight, their small brick house transformed into a classroom unlike any other. Daniel refused to surrender to darkness. Instead, He taught Naomi to pay attention to details most people ignored. He asked her to describe the direction of every breeze through an open window, the difference between leather shoes crossing hardwood and rubber soles crossing carpet, the faint scent left behind by fresh rain on warm pavement, and the subtle change in another person's breathing when they were hiding fear or guilt. While other children memorized songs on the radio, Naomi memorized footsteps. While classmates talked about fashion trends, she learned how voices bounced differently off narrow hallways and cathedral ceilings. Daniel often smiled and told her, "Most people think sight begins with the eyes. They are wrong. Real vision begins when you finally listen." Those lessons stayed with her long after he passed away. Years later, they inspired her to volunteer with organizations serving visually impaired families throughout New York City. She never sought recognition. She preferred helping guests navigate crowded museums, charity events, and public fundraisers without making them feel dependent. That quiet reputation eventually brought her to the Whitmore Foundation Gala. She had arrived nearly 2 hours before the first guest, carefully checking floor layouts, counting staircases, memorizing the location of every table, and greeting volunteers by name. Richard Whitmore had no reason to remember her from previous events. She always remained in the background, making certain others felt comfortable while she quietly disappeared into the rhythm of service. Earlier that evening, she had noticed something that refused to leave her thoughts. Every time Richard reached naturally toward the place where he expected Evelyn to be, there had been the smallest pause before she answered him. Sometimes another person gently redirected his arm first. Sometimes her heels echoed from farther away than they should have. Sometimes the expensive floral perfume everyone associated with Evelyn drifted across the room several seconds after she had already spoken. Individually, each detail meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern Naomi could not ignore. She had questioned herself repeatedly, hoping she was mistaken. Yet the longer she listened, the clearer the picture became. Now, standing beneath hundreds of watchful eyes as security politely motioned toward the ballroom entrance, Naomi felt the familiar ache of remembering her father. Daniel had once told her that telling the truth often carried a price, especially when the truth threatened someone who had built an entire life on unquestioned trust. She never imagined those words would return inside a room where every polished smile concealed another unanswered question. The ballroom doors closed softly behind Naomi as one of the security officers escorted her into the wide marble corridor overlooking the Hudson River. The cool evening air slipped through the glass entrance each time another guest arrived, carrying with it the scent of rain drifting across Manhattan. Inside the ballroom, however, the celebration quickly resumed. Laughter slowly replaced whispers as if everyone had silently agreed that the uncomfortable interruption had already become yesterday's news. Richard Whitmore remained at the center of the room, accepting sympathetic comments from business leaders, politicians, and longtime donors who assured him that he had handled the unexpected situation with dignity. Every reassuring voice strengthened the wall of certainty surrounding him. For 12 years, Richard had trusted one person above everyone else. Evelyn had become his eyes after darkness claimed his vision. She described paintings hanging in museums they visited together. She narrated sunsets during vacations on the California coast. She selected his neckties before board meetings and quietly guided his hand toward every outstretched handshake at charity events. To Richard, her voice had become more dependable than sight itself. That trust had transformed into something almost sacred. Few people knew how difficult those first years had been after the helicopter accident. Once celebrated as one of the youngest investment executives on Wall Street, Richard suddenly found himself unable to recognize his own reflection. Reporters questioned whether his career had ended. Competitors quietly circled his company like vultures. Even close friends drifted away, unsure how to speak to a man whose future seemed permanently altered. Evelyn never left. Newspapers praised her devotion. Television interviews called them the perfect example of resilience. Their marriage became a symbol of loyalty admired across America. Together they established the Whitmore Vision Foundation, donating millions of dollars to research, adaptive technology, scholarships, and rehabilitation centers. Their photographs appeared in magazines beside headlines celebrating compassion, perseverance, and hope. To the public, They represented everything people wanted to believe about love surviving hardship. Yet beneath the polished image, subtle routines had quietly changed over recent months without Richard noticing. Evelyn increasingly answered questions on his behalf before he could speak. She scheduled private meetings he never personally confirmed. Financial documents arrived with neatly placed signature tabs, each accompanied by warm explanations that discouraged unnecessary concern. Richard trusted every word because trusting Evelyn required less effort than doubting the person who had rebuilt his life. Across the ballroom, Evelyn finally broke her silence. Her voice floated gently through the crowd as she apologized to guests for what she described as an unfortunate misunderstanding involving an overzealous volunteer. Her explanation sounded graceful, measured, almost rehearsed. Smiles returned. Champagne glasses rose once more. The orchestra shifted into a brighter melody while conversations drifted back toward philanthropy, investments, and upcoming galas. Richard relaxed slightly as Evelyn rested a reassuring hand over his wrist. At least, he believed it was her hand. He smiled faintly, unaware that several feet away another pair of elegant heels crossed the marble floor almost at the exact same moment. The sounds overlapped so perfectly that no one else noticed the impossible contradiction. No one except the woman who had just been escorted outside, standing alone beneath the cold evening sky, replaying every footstep she had heard since Richard entered the building and wondering how long a carefully constructed illusion could survive once someone finally chose to listen instead of simply looking. Naomi did not leave immediately. She stood beneath the stone overhang outside the museum, where the soft glow from antique lanterns spilled across the rain-dark sidewalk in long ribbons of amber light. Blacktown cars arrived one after another, their engines humming quietly before attendants opened polished doors for guests dressed in tailored tuxedos and evening gowns. Behind the towering glass windows, the orchestra continued playing as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Naomi reached into the canvas volunteer bag hanging from her shoulder and removed the folded guest assistant schedule she had carried throughout the evening. On the back was a blank space. She borrowed a pen from the elderly doorman, thanked him with a gentle smile, and began writing from memory. 7:21. Richard entered through the east entrance. Evelyn greeted him 3 seconds later than expected. 7:26. A donor from Boston shook Richard's hand before Evelyn identified him by name. 7:34. Richard reached toward his wife's voice, but another person quietly redirected his arm. 7:42. 2 different pairs of heels crossed the marble floor within seconds of each other, while Evelyn continued speaking from only one location. Naomi closed her eyes after writing each observation, carefully replaying every sound exactly as her father had taught her years ago. She never trusted emotion. She trusted patterns. Inside the ballroom, Richard accepted another congratulatory handshake while Evelyn effortlessly guided conversations away from the earlier interruption. She laughed softly at appropriate moments, thanked generous sponsors, and praised the Foundation's newest scholarship program with practiced warmth. No one questioned her confidence. No one noticed that she frequently excused herself for brief moments before returning with perfectly timed explanations. Richard remained completely at ease. The familiar cadence of her voice reassured him whenever uncertainty tried to enter his thoughts. He believed the evening had recovered. He believed the uncomfortable encounter was over. Outside, Naomi carefully folded the handwritten notes and slipped them into a plain white envelope she found inside her volunteer packet. She wrote only 2 words across the front in neat block letters. For Richard, she knew he would probably never read it. Security might discard it before it ever reached him. Even if it did, he would almost certainly dismiss every word inside. Still, remaining silent would have haunted her far longer than being ignored. She stepped back toward the entrance where the same security officer who had escorted her outside noticed the envelope in her hands. He hesitated before speaking. "Ma'am, I am sorry about what happened." Naomi smiled faintly. "You were only doing your job." He glanced through the glass doors toward the ballroom. "Do you really believe you heard something everyone else missed?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "I do not believe it. I know it." The officer studied her face for a long moment before accepting the envelope. "I cannot promise he will see this." "You do not have to promise," Naomi replied quietly. Just make sure no one else opens it first. As she turned toward the rain-swept sidewalk, the museum doors briefly opened behind her. Warm music drifted into the cool night air, followed by the unmistakable echo of elegant high heels crossing polished marble. Naomi stopped walking for only a heartbeat. The footsteps were moving away from Richard again, even though guests inside were applauding as if Evelyn had never left his side. Naomi slowly pulled her coat tighter against the evening breeze and whispered to herself, "Someone is counting on the fact that he cannot see, but they forgot that sound never lies." Naomi had only walked half a block before the rain finally began to fall in earnest, soft drops tapping against the sidewalks and the shoulders of her dark coat. The city lights blurred across the wet pavement, turning every reflection into a ribbon of gold and silver. She stopped beneath the awning of a small coffee shop across from the museum and looked back once. Through the towering windows, she could still see the glow of the gala, warm and distant, like another world that had already decided her place within it. Inside, applause erupted again. Outside, her phone vibrated with a message from the volunteer coordinator. The words were brief and painfully formal. Effective immediately, your volunteer services are no longer required at future Whitmore Foundation events. Thank you for your previous contributions. Naomi stared at the screen for several quiet seconds before locking it without replying. She had expected nothing less. The envelope now rested somewhere inside the museum, and whether Richard ever received it was beyond her control. Across town, however, the story had already begun spreading. A guest had quietly uploaded a short video showing only the moment Naomi spoke and the shocked reaction that followed. Without context, the internet quickly filled the missing pieces with assumptions. Headlines called her an attention seeker. Comment sections accused her of trying to embarrass a respected philanthropist. Others questioned why she had interrupted a charity event at all. Very few people asked what she had actually heard. Truth traveled slowly. Judgment rarely did. Back inside the ballroom, Richard excused himself from another conversation and stepped into a quieter private lounge reserved for board members. The thick carpet absorbed every footstep, while a fireplace cast gentle warmth across dark walnut bookshelves. Evelyn entered moments later carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. She placed one carefully into Richard's hand before resting her fingers lightly against his sleeve. "You handled everything beautifully," she said with reassuring calm. Richard released a slow breath. "I do not enjoy humiliating people." Evelyn smiled softly. "She forced your hand by making such an outrageous accusation." Richard nodded, yet something inside him refused to settle. It was not Naomi's words alone that lingered. It was the certainty with which she had spoken them. She had sounded frightened, but not dishonest. He had spent decades negotiating billion-dollar contracts and listening for deception hidden beneath polished speeches. Tonight, for the first time in years, he found himself unable to dismiss a stranger's voice. Meanwhile, the security officer who had accepted Naomi's envelope remained standing near the entrance, debating whether to leave it with the event coordinator as protocol required or personally deliver it to Richard. He turned the plain white envelope over in his hands. There was no return address, no demand, no signature, only 2 words written with careful precision. For Richard. Before he could decide, another member of the event staff approached and asked him to assist with guest departures. Reluctantly, he slipped the envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket, intending to deliver it before the evening ended. He never noticed someone watching from the opposite end of the hallway. Elegant heels clicked once across the marble floor before stopping. A pleasant voice thanked another guest nearby, then fell silent. By the time the officer looked up again, the corridor was empty. Only the faint scent of expensive white lilies lingered in the air, and for reasons he could not explain, he instinctively checked to make sure the envelope was still in his pocket. Rain continued to fall long after the final guests left the museum, washing the city streets until every traffic light shimmered across the pavement like scattered glass. Naomi rode the subway home in silence, still wearing the volunteer badge she had forgotten to remove. The nearly empty train rocked gently beneath the East River while tired commuters stared through fogged windows, each carrying burdens invisible to everyone else. She rested one hand on the worn canvas bag beside her and listened to the rhythm of steel wheels against the tracks. Her father used to say that every journey had its own sound if someone cared enough to notice. Tonight, those familiar echoes brought comfort instead of certainty. She wondered whether she had done the right thing, not because she doubted what she had heard, but because speaking the truth had already cost her something she quietly loved. Volunteering had never been about recognition. It had simply allowed her to help people who experienced the world the way her father once had. Losing that opportunity left an ache she could not easily explain. Across the city, Richard finally returned to the penthouse overlooking Central Park. The spacious apartment felt unusually quiet despite its elegant design and panoramic windows. Evelyn excused herself almost immediately, explaining that she wanted to answer messages from donors before going to bed. Richard thanked her, then remained alone in his study where the faint scent of cedar shelves mixed with freshly brewed coffee left warming on the side table. He reached toward the familiar leather chair and slowly lowered himself into it. For years, this room had been where he made impossible decisions with absolute confidence. Tonight, his certainty felt strangely fragile. He replayed the evening from beginning to end, listening not with his ears, but with memory. Naomi's voice returned first. Calm, respectful, unshaken. She had never sounded angry. She had never asked for money, attention, or sympathy. She had simply spoken as though she believed Richard deserved to know something no one else had noticed. He leaned back and quietly rubbed the smooth handle of his cane. Somewhere beyond the closed study door, he heard Evelyn laughing softly during a telephone conversation. The sound should have reassured him. Instead, it felt farther away than usual. A memory surfaced without warning. Nearly 6 months earlier, during another charity dinner, he had reached instinctively for Evelyn's hand after someone introduced an old friend. He distinctly remembered touching empty air for a brief second before she gently took his arm and joked that he had reached too soon. At the time, he had laughed with her. Tonight, that forgotten moment returned carrying an unfamiliar weight. Had it really happened the way he remembered, or had Naomi's words simply planted doubt where none belonged? Meanwhile, inside the museum, the security officer finally finished his overnight shift. As he changed into his street clothes, his fingers brushed against the inside pocket of his jacket. He froze. The envelope was still there. Exhaustion had pushed it completely from his mind. He carefully removed it and stared at the simple handwriting beneath the fluorescent locker room lights. For Richard, no demand, no accusation, no signature, only quiet certainty folded inside ordinary paper. He slipped the envelope into his briefcase with a silent promise to deliver it personally the following morning, unaware that a single unopened letter now carried the first thread capable of unraveling an illusion that had been carefully woven for years. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale sunlight that filtered through low clouds hanging above Manhattan, leaving the city unusually quiet after the previous night's celebration. Richard entered his office on the top floor of Whitmore Capital just after 8 o'clock, guided by familiar footsteps and the gentle hum of elevators beginning another business day. Before the first meeting could begin, his executive assistant knocked softly and announced that a security officer from the museum insisted on delivering something personally. Richard invited him inside. The officer apologized for the delay and placed a plain white envelope into Richard's waiting hands. A volunteer asked me to make sure only you received this, he explained before quietly leaving the office. Richard traced his fingertips across the paper. There was nothing remarkable about it except the careful handwriting spelling 2 simple words. For Richard, he unfolded the single sheet inside. There were no accusations, no emotional appeals, and no dramatic conclusions. Instead, Naomi had written nothing but times, locations, and observations. 7:21. Entered through east entrance. Wife responded after a 3-second delay. 7:26. Donor. Approached before wife identified him. 7:34. Right arm redirected by another person before wife's voice answered. 7:42. 2 separate sets of high heels crossed the ballroom, while wife continued speaking from another location. At the bottom, she had added one final sentence. If I am wrong, please throw this away. If I am right, ask your security team for the hallway recordings before they are automatically erased. Richard lowered the page slowly. The precision unsettled him far more than any accusation could have. Naomi had not claimed to know Evelyn's intentions. She had only documented facts exactly as she perceived them. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. Michael, I need the museum security footage from last night. Every hallway. Every entrance. Especially the east wing. His assistant hesitated. Sir, is something wrong? Richard answered after a long pause. I do not know yet. Less than an hour later, Michael returned carrying a tablet and several synchronized security reports. Since Richard could not see the recordings himself, Michael described every frame carefully, exactly as requested. At 7:21, Richard entered through the east entrance. 3 seconds later, Evelyn emerged from a side corridor rather than walking beside him. At 7:26, while Richard greeted a donor, another female staff member lightly redirected his arm before Evelyn approached from several feet away. Richard remained silent. Michael continued. At 7:42, 2 camera angles showed something impossible to ignore. Evelyn had stepped into a private hallway to answer a telephone call, while another woman wearing a dress of similar color remained beside Richard, responding whenever guests addressed his wife from a distance. Richard's fingers slowly tightened around the edge of his desk. Play that again, he whispered. Michael replayed the sequence. The timing matched Naomi's handwritten notes almost perfectly. Not one observation had been exaggerated. Not one detail had been invented. Richard felt the room grow strangely still. For the first time since losing his eyesight 12 years earlier, he realized that someone had quietly manipulated the trust he valued above everything else. The stranger everyone had dismissed had not interrupted his evening to embarrass him. She had tried to protect him, and the certainty with which he had rejected her now echoed through the silence more loudly than any words spoken at the gala. Richard canceled every meeting scheduled for the rest of the day. The conference room outside his office slowly emptied until only silence remained, interrupted now and then by the distant sound of elevators opening and closing somewhere down the hallway. Michael stood nearby, uncertain whether to speak. After several minutes, Richard finally broke the silence. Please find Naomi Brooks. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the confidence that had defined every business decision for decades. Michael nodded once. We already have her volunteer records. She lives in Brooklyn. I can arrange a meeting this afternoon. Richard slowly shook his head. Do not arrange anything. I will go to her. By late afternoon, a black sedan rolled through a quiet neighborhood lined with aging brick apartment buildings, neighborhood bakeries, and children riding bicycles home from school. It was a world far removed from penthouses and charity galas, yet Richard noticed something peaceful in the sounds drifting through the open window. He heard neighbors greeting one another by name, a dog barking somewhere beyond a small fenced yard, wind moving gently through maple trees, and the distant bell of an ice cream truck turning onto another street. Michael guided him toward a modest apartment building where Naomi had lived for nearly 7 years. She answered the door wearing a simple blue sweater, surprised but composed. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Richard lowered his head before saying the first words. Miss Brooks, I came here because I owe you an apology. Naomi quietly invited them inside. Her apartment was small but filled with warmth. Family photographs rested on wooden shelves. A well-used piano stood beside the window. Books lined one wall, many of them printed in both standard text and braille. Richard smiled faintly as his fingertips brushed the raised lettering on one volume. My father taught himself braille after losing his sight, Naomi explained softly. Richard nodded without speaking. He could feel the weight of every assumption he had made the previous evening. After they sat at the small kitchen table, he carefully unfolded the handwritten note she had given him. Every observation you recorded was accurate, he admitted. The security footage confirmed each one. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. I was hoping I had been wrong. Richard slowly exhaled. So was I. The room fell quiet except for the soft ticking of an old wall clock and the faint sound of rain beginning again outside the window. Richard clasped his hands together. Yesterday, I believed you were trying to damage my family. Instead, you were trying to protect me. Naomi looked at him with genuine compassion rather than satisfaction. I never wanted to come between you and your wife. I only wanted you to know what I heard. Richard's voice became almost unsteady. For years I believed losing my eyesight was the greatest challenge of my life. Yesterday I discovered something far worse. I stopped listening. Naomi offered a gentle smile. Trust is not a weakness, Mr. Whitmore. It only becomes dangerous when it is never questioned. Richard remained silent for several seconds before standing. "There will be difficult conversations ahead," he said quietly. "But before any of that happens, I needed to thank the person who chose honesty even after being dismissed." Naomi rose as well. "You do not owe me anything." Richard turned toward her voice. "On the contrary," he answered. "You gave me back something I thought disappeared 12 years ago. Not my eyesight. My judgment." For the first time since they met, both of them shared the same quiet understanding that truth had not divided two strangers. It had brought them to the beginning of something far more valuable than either of them had expected. Several months passed, and autumn quietly gave way to winter before the Whitmore Vision Foundation welcomed guests to its annual community open house once again. This time the atmosphere felt different. There were no velvet ropes separating donors from volunteers, no carefully staged introductions, and no speeches celebrating one person's generosity. Instead, the building buzzed with conversations between families, teachers, therapists, students, and people living with vision loss who had gathered simply to share experiences and hope. Richard Whitmore stood near the entrance with his familiar white cane, greeting each visitor personally. He still could not see their faces, but he no longer depended on someone else to describe the people around him. He listened carefully to every voice, every laugh, every hesitant pause before someone spoke. Somewhere along the way, he had discovered that slowing down allowed him to notice far more than rushing ever had. Naomi Brooks arrived quietly, just as she always had. She wore the same calm smile that had once been mistaken for weakness and carried a small stack of Braille reading guides she had helped develop for families adjusting to life after sudden vision loss. Children immediately surrounded her, asking questions and laughing as she patiently demonstrated simple techniques for identifying objects through touch and sound. Richard heard the familiar warmth in her voice before Michael gently informed him that she had entered the room. A genuine smile crossed his face. He walked toward her without hesitation. "Miss Brooks," he said, "thank you for coming." Naomi smiled. "I told you before, it is just Naomi." Richard nodded with quiet appreciation. "Then thank you, Naomi." Nearby, a polished bronze plaque had been installed beside the entrance to the Foundation's new education center. It did not bear Richard's name alone. Instead, it carried a simple inscription, dedicated to everyone who chooses truth even when it is uncomfortable, because real vision begins with listening. Naomi paused for a moment after reading the words with her fingertips. She recognized her father's lesson hidden inside them. She never mentioned it. She simply smiled toward the sunlight pouring through the tall windows. Outside, fresh snow had begun falling over Central Park, softening the sounds of the busy city beyond. Inside, children practiced reading Braille beside retired teachers. Volunteers guided visitors through interactive exhibits, and conversations filled every corner of the building with quiet life. There was no applause, no dramatic announcement, only ordinary people helping one another without expecting recognition. Richard stood listening to those sounds for a long moment before turning slightly toward Naomi. "You once told me that trust becomes dangerous when it is never questioned," he said softly. "I think I finally understand." Naomi looked around the room before answering. "The wonderful thing about truth is that it does not ask us to be perfect. It only asks us to be willing to learn." Richard lowered his head thoughtfully. "And kindness." Naomi's smile grew a little warmer. "Kindness gives people the courage to learn." Neither of them spoke again. They simply stood together as sunlight reflected across the polished floor. Children's laughter echoed gently through the hall, and snow continued falling beyond the glass. In the peaceful silence that followed, Richard realized he had not regained his eyesight. He had gained something far more valuable. He had learned that dignity can arrive from the most unexpected voice. Wisdom does not depend on status, and the clearest vision often belongs to the people the world overlooks first. The room remained filled with quiet conversation as winter light settled gently across the foundation, and for the first time in many years, everything that truly mattered could be heard without anyone needing to say another word.